So let's go and start from the top again. And I'm going to open a connection to the CIS DBSS database that you used in 275 and the names database. And here's a query that fetches the data for the name Mark for both genders in all the years, which range from 1915 through 2014 for Mark, and it includes the name count. Now, I've explored this data already, but one thing that I can do pretty easily is actually graph this as a line plot. In order to graph it as a line plot, the simplest way of doing that is you start with the data frame itself, and then there's a plot method. And by default, what this plot method is going to do is it's going to take any numeric values in columns like year and name count, and it's going to graph those as y on the y-axis against this index. Now, this isn't really what I want to use because I don't want to graph from 0 to 145 the value of year and name count. Let's actually see what that looks like. So what I ended up with is it's bouncing up and down because it's showing male and female values, and the male values are all sort of up here and the female values are sort of down there, and so it's bouncing around back and forth. And also there's a separate plot for the year which goes from 1914 up, or 1915 up through 2014. Really what I want to do is I want to use the year for the x-axis and then just have name count on the y-axis, but I only want to graph male data in one column and female data in the other column. So basically two trends, one for male, one for female. The x-axis should be the year, and then the y-axis will be the name count for male trend and for female trend. So the first thing I need to do if I want to make that happen is I need to move this year data out of being a regular column and actually make it be the index for this data. And there's a command to do that called set index. So if I print df, it looks like that. And then if I do before that, I do df.setIndex and then give it the name of a column. That's actually going to move the year data into the index and then return a data frame with this new index. So if I look at the results there, this new data frame has the year in the index column and then name, gender, and name count as regular columns. Now, this didn't actually change the data frame. It just returned a copy of it. So if I print data frame after that, you see I still have the original data in data frame. And then if I print the value that this returns, I see that it's got year in the index. Now, a lot of these methods have an in-place argument, which I can set to true. And then if I look at df after that, I actually got an error here. Yeah, so now year isn't in the column anymore because I just blew it away. So let me just go ahead and comment that off for a second. We'll look at df. So you see the data in df has actually changed, and there's not a year column anymore. It's actually set in the index. And so if I try to execute this command again, df.setIndexYear, this is going to fail because there's no column called year anymore. So I changed the data in such a way that I can't run this command again. Now, in order to fix that, there's also a command called resetIndex. And if you reset the index, let me go ahead and look at what that returns. That's going to put the old index year back as a column and then create a new index, which is just the numeric ordering of the columns. So set index will set year to be the index and reset index will clear that change and put the column back and with a new index. And then once again, if I print the original value of df here, you see that df still has year in the index because I didn't do this in place. So this is going to return a copy of the data with the index reset. If I want to do that in place, I can do that. And now if I print df, you'll see that the df is reset. And then here, if I do df.setIndex print df, that's going to have year as the index. And then if I reset index and print df, it's going to have year as a column. So here's year as an index, and here is year as a column. So the first step in doing what I want to do is being able to control what's in the index. And I'm going to go ahead and leave year as the index column, and then add a column after that. And now I'm going to call df.plot, and it should have year as the x-coordinate, which is what I want. So now what do I do about this name? Or I'm sorry, about this gender. So it's alternating male and female gender. Well, the first thing I could do is I could just filter out all the data except for the male data and plot that. So I can say, instead of df.plot, I can say df sub, and then here it's going to be df sub gender is equal male. So this right here is going to return a series of true and false values. And then when you pass a series of true or false values in to these square brackets, it's going to pull out the rows where this value is true and skip the rows where this value is false. So this is going to only plot the rows where the gender column is equal to m. And if I do that here, I see the name count for males. And now I can also plot the name count for females. So here's for males, and then here in this separate graph, here's for females. And you see the range of the y values goes from 5, which is the minimum number before the Census Bureau will list it in the data. So at least 5 female babies have to be given the name Mark in a particular year for the year to show up in the data set at all, up to the maximum, which was around 1970, where 25 female babies were named MARC, compared with 5,000 male babies named MARC in 1970. So I can pull out either one set of data for this graph or a different set of data for this graph. But if I want to combine them on the same plot, what I really want to do is, well, let's look at the shape of the data. So I'm going to print the shape of this data again. I'm going to get rid of that. So here's the data that I'm working with, and you'll notice that first I have a bunch of male values, and then mixed in here are some female values as well, which you can't really see very easily. Let me go ahead and just print df sub gender. So I'm just going to pull out all the gender values and print them. And then I get 146 rows. Let me do gender dot value count. So value counts, there's actually 100 male values and 46 female values, because there's a lot of years where there were less than 5 babies that were female. But these are all in one long column. So this is called long form data because basically the values for gender are stacked up into a long row. What I actually want, though, is something called wide form data, where the female data is in one column and the male data is in a separate column. So how do I convert this long form data into wide form data? The way you can do that is using a pivot. And let me show you what a pivot looks like in pandas. So to pivot the data, I'm going to call this pivoted is equal to df.pivot. And then you give it 3 values. You give it a column to use as the index. And I already have year set as the index here, so let's not do that. Let's do df.resetIndex in place equals true. And says none of you are in the column, so it's probably reset. Let's go ahead and print it here. Let me comment that out for a second and see what I'm working with here. Okay, so df has year, df.resetIndex in place is true. And then we'll print df. Okay, so that's reset. So to pivot this, the first thing I want to give it is the name of the column or columns that I want to use for the index as a result. So that's going to be index equals year. And then I need to give it the column that holds my long form data. So basically I want to take gender, which is long form, and I want to split it into multiple columns, which is wide form. And so gender is going to be my columns. And then the last thing I want to give it is when it splits gender into 2 separate columns, what should it use for the values in those columns? So one of them is going to be gender is male, and what number or value do I want to put for gender equals male for 1915? And what do I want to do for gender equals female for 1915? So the value that I want to put there is actually the name count for 1915 in male for male, and then the name count for 1915 in female for female. And so values equals name count. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at pivoted when we do that. And you'll see that I get a bunch of nada numbers because there were a lot of columns that didn't have any values for females. And I could drop those, or I could supply values, or I could just leave it as not a number. But if I go ahead and plot this now, cannot insert level 0 already exists. So let me, because I did this reset in place, so I need to not do that anymore. Yeah, so this is why I generally avoid using in place, because you have to keep track of where you are at each step. Okay, so here's my male data, and I get this legend for free. So my male gender data is here. My female data is here, and I have a lot of missing values because there were no babies registered, less than 5 in a particular year, that were female. And then let's look at pivoted again, like so.